Hello, everyone. I will now shortly introduce the themes that people mentioned the most in the forum. So, on the first question, to what extent do you think has our community reflected and applied the UWC mission in daily life at Pearson College? With 5 being completely and 1 being not at all, 40% of the people answered 2 on the scale, and 40% of the people answered 3. No one answered with number 5. On the second question, what could we do better to uphold peace as a key part of our mission? Most of the answers evolved around more careful listening of others' perspectives, creating more spaces where different perspectives can be heard. But maybe the most prevalent was the answer regarding action. It seems like our community is very eager for more practical, real-life ways in which we can uphold the UWC values. I will call upon you to think about this and maybe examine individually what kind of action I want to create personally in the future, or what can we do as a community that I can personally take first initiative of. On the third question, have your views on waging peace changed given your time at Pearson? 66% of the people answered yes, and there were many different ways in which that was true for each of them individually. However, most of them said that their time at Pearson allowed them to see the complexity of how peace is often achieved, as well as that it's not always as straightforward and can seem different through different perspectives. On the fourth question, how successful do you think the UWC model of the mission is in solving or decreasing world conflicts, with 1 being very low success and 5 being very high success? Most of the answers were 2, and the second highest number was 4, which was a pretty interesting divide within our community. On the last question, are there any particular ways that you could think of for how we can work towards upholding peace on a broader world scale? Many of the answers were talking about creating more UWC opportunities for people across the world, more scholarships and more experiences and more diversity. Given that not everyone in this community received the results, it's interesting still to see how some of the people feel, and we should by no means consider these results discouraging, but they should only motivate us to pay more attention and work with more dedication towards building our community and hopefully learn from our mistakes. Please continue to reflect on these results as we move along the session, and especially for year 48, as we look upon another year at Pearson. So without further ado, I will now introduce today's topic and the speaker. The topic will be waging peace and preventing war in a divided world. And our today's guest is Dr. Abby Williams. Dr. Abby Williams is director of the Institute for Global Leadership and professor of the practice of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Previously, he was president of the Hague Institute for Global Justice. From 2011 to 2012, he served as senior vice president of the Center for Conflict Management at the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. He led USIP's work in major conflict zones such as Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. He served as vice president of USIP's Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention from 2008 to 2011, and had primary responsibility for the Institute's work on conflict prevention in Iran and Northeast Asia. From 2001 to 2007, he served as director of the Strategic Valuable Field Operation Experience, serving with the United Nations from 1994 to 2000 in peacekeeping operations in the Balkans and in Haiti, in senior political and humanitarian roles. He has served as Associate Dean of the African Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., and held faculty appointments in Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and University of Rochester. He is a former chair of the Academic Council on the United Nations System and member of the UN Secretary General Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters. Abi Williams is, before everything else, an alumnus of Pearson College, Year 4, a former trustee of Pearson College, and a former member of the International Board of Directors of UWC. Welcome, dear Professor Abi Williams.
Well, good afternoon to everyone at Pearson College, and thank you very much, Georgina, for that very kind and generous introduction. I'm also deeply grateful to Samuel for inviting me and all the members of the Global Affairs team, Georgina, of course, and then Brooke and Malaika and Vuk. So thank you so much. I wish I could be with you there in Max Bell Hall and on the shores of Pedder Bay. And I don't know if you can see them on your screen, but I'm also delighted to see Marx and Marg Macavity, my teachers at Pearson College, and really delighted also to see Julie Scott, who was such a great help to me and to so many students there in the old administration building there, and working so closely with Jack Matthews, our director. So even though I'm far away, it feels very much like a homecoming. For me, Pearson College was a life-changing experience. It changed my view of the world and of myself, opening up new horizons of possibility and teaching me not only about history and literature and social anthropology, but teaching me volumes about my own potential. And I hope that all of you current students are having an equally transformative experience there at the college. It is heartening to speak to you students at Pearson. Heartening because unlike advancements in science and technology, the art of peace is one that must be forged anew by each generation. History teaches us in its most tragic chapters that progress towards fostering peace and justice is rarely linear. Rather, it requires constant effort, as well as the application of expertise, not just across borders, but across generations. It is for this reason that I believe so strongly that those operating in the spheres of international politics and diplomacy must engage with younger people as often as possible. We must ensure that the insights that we have gleaned are transmitted to you, the leaders of tomorrow. We must also solicit and apply the perspectives that your generation has to offer. And so this afternoon, I seek to learn from you, as well as to offer lessons from my own experience. Preventing war and waging peace in a divided world is a topic which is timely and of vital importance. Russia's bloody and brutal invasion of Ukraine, which began on February 24th, has dramatized the imperative of conflict prevention. Over the past 6 weeks, 20,000 people have been killed. More than 4.2 million refugees have fled the country, and nearly 6.5 million people have been internally displaced. This threat is not just to Ukraine, it is also a threat to Europe and to the wider world. It is caused by one man, and one man alone, one man with dangerous fantasies of ethno-nationalism, conquest, and domination. But the horror in Ukraine must also remind us of the tragedy of war in other parts of the world. In Ethiopia, as many as 500,000 people have died from the violence and hunger caused by the war during the past 16 months. That is 117,000 more people than the population in the greater Victoria area of British Columbia, where you were living and studying. Over the past 11 years, at least 580,000 Syrians have been killed, and more than 13 million Syrians have been displaced. In Yemen, more than 4 million people have been displaced, and escalating violence made January the deadliest month for civilians since 2018, with one civilian killed or injured every hour. And in Myanmar, military and security forces have committed widespread abuses and deliberately targeted civilians. Peace cannot ever be taken for granted, and war is possible everywhere. Conflict prevention is, of course, a founding principle of the United Nations. The United Nations was established in the aftermath of the horrors of the Second World War, and preventing conflict was at the forefront of the framers of the UN Charter. In the evocative words of the preamble to the Charter, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. This primordial goal is also stated in the Charter's very first article, which declares the UN's intention to maintain international peace and security, and to that end, to take effective collective measures for the removal and the prevention of threats to the peace. Although the aspiration of the Charter is noble and sound, realizing it has been a Herculean task. The urgency for engaging in conflict prevention rests on moral, economic, and strategic considerations. The self-evident moral imperative asserts that mass violence invariably leads to increased levels of human loss, and frequently to wars between and within states that produce widespread atrocities. The standard practice of reaction to conflict not only engenders greater human costs, but it is also invariably more expensive. The shift from war to peace and the robust rebuilding initiatives that typically characterize post-conflict work require massive financial commitments, typically vastly in excess of conflict prevention efforts. I witnessed this disparity firsthand when serving in two very different UN peacekeeping operations in the Balkans. In Macedonia, for an annual cost of around $50 million, the international community prevented a southern escalation of the wars which were then raging in former Yugoslavia. In contrast, in my other peacekeeping operation in Bosnia, the tardy response of the international community to the war in Bosnia not only cost thousands of human lives, but billions of dollars had to be spent on reconstruction and, of course, the continuing fragility of the reconciliation process in Bosnia. And strategically, not engaging in effective conflict prevention has regional and global implications of spillover. Outbursts of deadly violence can spread and destabilize entire regions, as well as contribute to international security challenges. The overwhelming human, financial, and political costs of conflict are a stark but all too common testament to the continuing need for greater international attention to conflict prevention. That said, conflict prevention is not easy. The causes of war are complex. The main sources of armed conflict include ruthless and demagogic leaders, and we're witnessing that in Ukraine with the invasion of Russia. And in Ukraine itself, we're seeing a different kind of leadership, forward-looking, dynamic, principled by the president of Ukraine. You can have inequality among social groups based on ethnicity, religion, national identity, or economic class. The deliberate mobilization of grievances, often propagated by hate media, and hate media now facilitated by social media, and the struggle for economic resources. And now we have climate change, which is a growing threat, as the greatest impact of climate change is being felt by societies which are struggling with poverty and instability. In addition to all these complex sources of war and conflict, we have states which are threatened with conflict, which often refuse to recognize the fact or consider that any external involvement would likely make matters worse. And also, external powers who might be able to assist are often not sufficiently motivated or lack that essential element, which is political will. And it is important to mobilize political will, both domestically and internationally, using both moral arguments and ones that redefine the national interest. And the combination of moral arguments and a redefinition of national interests is critically important, because for better or worse, our political leaders are political animals. And while abstract moral arguments might appeal to them in the abstract, those arguments are rarely sufficient to overcome political opposition. So life in the field of conflict prevention can be disheartening. Every new recourse to arms demonstrates the imperfection of our existing instruments. Yet, preventive action is possible, and when properly conceived, effective. War is caused by human beings and can be prevented and stopped by human action. An effective conflict prevention strategy requires knowledge about how to design and implement strategies for each unique case. There can, of course, be no cookie-cutter model that can apply in situations where there is a risk of conflict. Armed disputes are inherently unique, which requires that responses must take into account the political, economic, cultural, or social factors that gave rise to violence in a particular situation. In short, responses must be tailored to contextual realities. A preventive strategy involves, of course, operational prevention, and by that we usually mean measures which are taken in the face of an immediate crisis. A strategy must also focus on structural prevention, and those are the measures which ensure that the crisis does not arise in the first place. And if the crisis does arise, that you make sure that the crisis do not recur. And the third element is systemic prevention, which refers to measures to address global risk of conflict that transcend particular states. And here, for example, you can think of efforts to stem illicit flows of small arms and light weapons, and the measures which are taken to stop the spread of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. All of those are the kinds of measures that can happen at the systemic level. A preventive strategy also requires the right mix of diplomatic, political, economic, legal, and military instruments. So if we think of the political and diplomatic tools, you can think of mediation, good offices, the recognition of a government, or the normalization of relations with a new government, and of course, public diplomacy to put pressure to bring about change. With regard to the legal and the constitutional tools, there is sometimes a need for constitutional reform, formal power sharing mechanisms to make sure that groups which have been outside the political system or do not feel that they're fairly represented have a role to play in the government of a country. You can also think of human rights monitoring. With regard to the economic tools, restrictions on illicit financial flows, we can think of debt relief, the threat and use of targeted economic sanctions. And then with military and security tools, police reform is an example. In my third UN peacekeeping mission in Haiti, the mission there was a civilian police mission, which was aimed at training and professionalizing the Haitian National Police in a country which had no tradition of civilian policing. And lots of our effort was focused on that area to make sure that the police could be professionalized and could be trained. You can also have preventive military and police deployment and arms embargoes, and then of course the threat of force, which is essentially deterrence. My own long-standing faith in the importance of conflict prevention stems from an early experience of its success. The UN Preventive Deployment Force in Macedonia was the first peacekeeping operation in which I served and which was deployed in Macedonia from 1992 to 1999. UN peacekeepers were deployed before the outbreak of violent conflict instead of what is usually the pattern, waiting for hostilities to erupt and the bloodletting to occur. This groundbreaking preventive mission ensured, as I said, that violence which was raging in other parts of former Yugoslavia did not spill over into Macedonia, a country on the vital crossroads of the Southern Balkans. The success of UNPREDE provides salutary lessons which can be applied to guide international actors as they devise and implement preventive strategies. First, in the case of Macedonia, the critical element was political will. Peacekeepers were deployed in accordance with a request by Macedonia's president Kiro-Gligorov. The viability of undertaking preventive action is considerably enhanced when a state identifies the threat of emerging violence and has the determination and the courage and the will to solicit help. A second factor was timing. Timing is critical in comedy, it is critical in politics, it is also critical in preventive action. The force in Macedonia was deployed swiftly. Speed is as important as firepower and size in preventive deployment. Third, the mandate was clear and with realistically defined military and political objectives. On the military front, we had a mandate to monitor and to report any developments which could threaten Macedonia's stability and its integrity. And on the political front, the Security Council gave the Secretary General and the Special Representative of the Secretary General the authority to use his good offices to help to promote peace and stability within the country. So the military mandate was clear, and the political mandate was clear and also provided the needed flexibility that is so important and so critical in political and in diplomatic work. And finally, the mission had the appropriate human and financial resources to do the job. Because if you have a mandate and the resources are not sufficient, it is very difficult to carry out a mandate sufficiently. So let me say this, that as we survey a troubled and divided world, it is clear that the cosmopolitan ethic which UWC fosters is sorely wanting in many parts of the world and in many of our planet's corners. Those of us who are blessed with a UWC education, talent, and opportunity have a duty of service, especially to those who are less fortunate. Service also gives you an opportunity for leadership and is an important reminder that leadership and ambition have a wider purpose than our own individual pursuits. Those of us who know firsthand the value of intercultural connections have a special responsibility to counter the forces of division which manifest themselves in our communities and beyond. The pursuit of a more peaceful and just world is, like the bonds of UWC and the bonds of Pearson College, not limited to one generation. It is a mission and the work of successive generations. Today, it rests on your collective aspirations, in the commitment you will show as you complete further studies and put your limitless talents to use in the public, private, and non-profit sectors. And as you travel on life's journey, do not forget that striving to make the world a more peaceful and a more just place is your Pearson College heritage and your obligation. So thank you very much indeed.
All right, thank you so much. So we're now going to open it up to a discussion period. So I'll just ask people on Zoom, if you have any questions, just use the raise hand function in Zoom and we'll get to your questions. But if there's anyone here in person with us who has questions, we're now going to open it up for Professor Abi Williams to answer. Yeah, So if anyone has any questions, feel free. We've got one over here. All right, and when I come over, feel free to say your name and where you're from.
My name is Vitaly Martiniak. I'm from Ukraine. So the UN has failed to respond to the Russian violations of the international laws. In the last few decades, Russia turned its power of veto in the UN to the power of death. UN's inefficient responses to the Russian annexation of Crimea, occupation of Moldovan Transnistria, and the war against Georgia have led to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and the brutal deaths of thousands of Ukrainian civilians. So my question is to you, how the UN system can be reformed and how privileged countries with veto power can be effectively prosecuted for their violations of international law. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that very important question. When the UN was founded, in order to have a United Nations, it was the key countries, the 5 members of the Security Council. Then it was the Soviet Union, now Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, would not have accepted of a United Nations coming into being without the veto, certainly not the United States. The assumption, of course, was that those 5 nations would work together to prevent war and to maintain international peace and security. And then, of course, the Security Council became paralyzed due to the Cold War. The veto is clearly, of course, an impediment to taking action when a major power is directly involved. The Security Council, for one thing, reflects the political and the economic realities of a world of 1945 and does not reflect the realities of power politically, economically, of the world of the 21st century. My own view is that there is, of course, a move now, for example, supported by over 100 countries, that when issues, for example, of genocide and mass atrocities are involved, the veto should not apply. So that is a hopeful development. I think in the current situation with Ukraine, it is also hopeful that in the General Assembly, 141 countries voted to oppose and to censure Russia's aggression and intervention in Ukraine. That is a barometer of international public opinion. So that's a hopeful, I think, sign. And in terms of what happened today, the Human Rights Council voted in an unprecedented decision to suspend Russia from the work of the Human Rights Council, which is the very first time that that action has been taken against a P5 member. So although we have the clear impediment of the veto, other parts of the UN, the General Assembly, and today the Human Rights Council are sending clear signals that it is wrong to violate international law, to violate the Charter of the United Nations, and to put pressure on Russia. And we see, of course, the growing isolation of Russia through these actions.
All right, thank you so much. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Looking around. All right. Just check out the chat as well.
Yes, okay, so I have one question from one of the adults on campus, which was like a very interesting question. It's basically, do you think that sometimes attacks on violence or like violence, for example, like burning, like environmental actions, which like require like destruction of assets of like a huge firm that pollutes a lot, are methods that can be used to reach peace, one that don't necessarily evolve around diplomacy? at times?
Well, I do think that in terms of trying to bring a world which is more peaceful, action has to be taken in different areas. So you need action at the local level, you need action at the national level, you need action at the international level, international institutions, for example. And I also think that, as I said earlier, you have different tools that you can utilize to bring about change, whether it's political and diplomatic, whether it's economic, and so forth. And the important thing is to make sure that you have the right combination of tools and also that you have the right sequencing in terms of coming up with a strategy.
Wonderful. Okay, it looks like we have, do we have one in the audience or one on Zoom here? Okay, I see. Okay, one in person, and then we'll move to the one in the audience. Where was that hand? Is it right there? Okay, wonderful.
Is that me or is that somebody else?
We've got a student in person first, and then we'll move on to the Zoom.
Hey, I'm Or. I'm from Israel, and I was wondering, especially as being somebody from Israel, with all the problems that are going on over there for years now, how do you approach a situation like that to try to reconcile and to try to achieve peace when there's so much hate for so many years?
Yes, well, again, thank you very much for that really important question. I'll start with an anecdote. I remember when I was a student at Pearson College, I happened to be at the college when we had the Camp David Accords. And it brings back memories of my classmates from Israel. We had our own mini signing, classmate from Israel and a classmate from Egypt signing those accords and pointing and underlining the fact that peace is possible. It's very difficult. I think of all the challenges facing the international community, the situation there is one of the most intractable. But it does seem to me that you do not make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. And a peace agreement never satisfies all parties in a conflict. And it always requires difficult compromises. But what is also essential is that the leadership plays a critical role in situations which are that difficult and that intractable. And I think, of course, of the example of Nelson Mandela, who demonstrated a great vision and pragmatism, and the unique combination of vision and moral leadership and pragmatism, he elevated politics into statecraft. And not only was a statesman, he was a prophet, and was able to bring a suffering people to a negotiating table and to make painful compromises which were necessary for the future of South Africa. So leadership is vital on both sides if you're going to bring about peace in that troubled region. But it is possible and it is not. And leadership plays a vital role in preparing populations for the painful compromises which have to be made. And I would also say that Ralph Bunche, who was one of my heroes, was my heroes from my childhood. Ralph Bunche is often forgotten nowadays, but Ralph Bunche was an extraordinary individual, my great inspiration since my childhood. He was the first African-American and the first Black person to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And he won the Nobel Peace Prize because he brought about and was able to negotiate armistice agreements between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And he was the first person linked to the United Nations to win that prize. And when Lester Pearson came up with the whole idea of peacekeeping in Suez, Lester Pearson and Dag Hammarskjöld turned to Ralph Bunche to lead that mission. And Ralph Bunche was able to negotiate those agreements. Another example of the role of leadership, principled leadership, to bring parties together to find a solution to long-seated differences and problems.
There we go. Thank you so much. And I think we have a question in the Zoom. Is that right? Yes. And feel free on Zoom to just speak up, and yeah, you can ask your question.
Thank you. I'm probably the oldest one on this Zoom, which means I can share an anecdote or a real story. I was on a naval ship, a Canadian naval ship, going to Hawaii when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. And as many of you have heard or known or read, that intervention between the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union worked in terms of what could have been a nuclear disaster. Now, there wasn't a huge war in effect, which was just the Cold War, which was not very pleasant, but one had a feeling after the standoff between the two countries and the Soviet Union backed down, that we had a kind of principle in place, which is often called mutually assured destruction, which is kind of a negative principle, but it's a principle that there's no point using nuclear weapons because both sides will get ruined or destroyed. And I'm kind of curious, Abiodun, particularly now, where if anything, that principle sort of has failed because no one trusts the leader of the Russian state enough to realize that he might not push the button and create a nuclear war. So I have a feeling that the situation in Ukraine is much more complicated than the Cuban Missile Crisis was, because not only are people being brutally assaulted by war, but on the West side, the United States and NATO, there's just that slight worry that we must not go too far because Putin might really do the most awful thing we could imagine. I'd be interested in your comments on that, on the fact that nuclear weapons perhaps are no longer a deterrent to some pretty ghastly things happening, like in Ukraine, because we do not want to have ourselves escalate into a nuclear war.
Well, thank you very much, Marx, for that question. I think you're right, because my generation lived with the great fear of the possibility of a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. And we had hoped that the current generation, the current Pearson College students, would not have to suffer under that great overarching fear, which we did. And which is why it was so troubling and so worrying when we had the implicit threats from Putin about the possibility of using nuclear weapons. It is extremely dangerous. And I think you're absolutely right. It is one of the reasons why NATO has been extremely cautious, because you're dealing with an armed power, a nuclear armed power, the strongest nuclear power. And any kind of miscalculation could bring about more horror than we saw in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I think it calls again for the kind of sophistication and balance, restraint on the military side, putting the economic sanctions, supporting the Ukrainians, providing them with the weapons that they need. And I do think that it's having some effect in seeing the pullback that we're witnessing, at least for the time being in Ukraine, and the fact that the rapid conclusion of the war, which I think Russia had hoped, has not come to pass. But ultimately, it will all depend on the Russian people as to what happens. The international community can help in the ways I've just mentioned, but it is the Russian people who ultimately will determine the outcome of this struggle. I think Putin recognizes that, which is why he's blocking access to the news and trying to control the media. It is the first real global media war that we're having, because the Russian people will ultimately decide what happens.
All right, thank you. And just looking around for any more hands. Okay, I've got one over here.
Hi, my name is Galkidan from Ethiopia, year 47, and I had a question for you regarding like many situations. The situation in Ukraine is horrible, and I believe that the world reacted in such a manner that the Ukrainian people deserve by taking in refugees and helping financially. But in conflicts around the world, like the ones in Ethiopia, Syria, and Myanmar, the world and the media doesn't have the same reaction, especially seeing that the casualties have reached such a number. Why doesn't the world react in the same manner?
Well, thank you very much for that really important question. And I think that's why, having mentioned Ukraine, I mentioned all the other places where we're seeing ongoing conflict and war and violence, including Ethiopia. I think the world does not react in the same way for a number of reasons. I think first, of course, those areas seem to be far away from the major centers, from the West. I think there's also a feeling in some quarters that they're less demanding of our attention. You also have, as we're witnessing, that sort of affinity which people feel to those who look like them, to those who are closer to them. But what you do try, and that is part of the UWC ethic, to say that our concern should not stop just with those who look like us, or who share our race or our nationality, and that there should be a concern for people based on our understanding of human dignity. So I think it is important to keep the attention on all of those other parts of the world where there is ongoing conflict, where people are dying, and to make sure that they're provided with the resources which are needed, humanitarian resources, and also that we invest in the political and the diplomatic capital to help bring a resolution of those problems.
Thank you very much. And just looking around, any more before we move to the chat? Don't think so. All right, so I'm just going to read a couple that we have here. Okay, so we have an anonymous question that was directly messaged to us. In general terms, waging peace sounds like an actively destabilizing stance when the status quo is violent. What are your thoughts on students proactively proactively disobeying a rules-based system, for example, direct action civil disobedience? And also, would you be happy to share how educators can teach students to strategically and intelligently break the law and break rules in the spirit of good people break bad laws? So that's
well, thank you very much for the question. Civil disobedience has a very long and proud history. We had the civil rights movement here in the United States, and which challenged Jim Crow laws and discrimination. You also had civil disobedience in South Africa, you had civil disobedience in India, challenging British colonialism. So it is critically important. It is also critically important to challenge laws which are unjust. It's important to do so peacefully, I think, because violence always has unintended consequences. So always to focus on peaceful means to challenge laws which are wrong and rules which are unfair. In terms of what I think educators can do, we have to start, of course, with our syllabi. After the killing of George Floyd and the explosion of the global Black Lives Matter movement, there's a lot of discussion now about racial reckoning and issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have to look at the syllabi, what it is we teach, the subjects that we cover, the authors that we get the students to read so that they have a wide range of perspectives. If we have speakers and we bring them to class, we also have to think about the diversity of the speakers which we bring. So the students are exposed to a range of perspectives and a range of speakers and a range of views. And I think that is a huge contribution that educators can have in trying to prepare students for a world in which they can make useful contributions to promoting, say, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
All right, thank you. So this will be one of our last calls for any questions in the audience in person here. So just going to scan. Okay, we've got another question. And we'll probably do a few more before wrapping up the session. So if you have any, think of some.
Thank you. My name is Luna, and I'm from Ethiopia. My question is, what steps can be taken to achieve peace when there are like natural differences, such as race, that has even been reinforced by history or governance system? You have previously touched over this, and how can we bring people to reflect back on like human dignity and not divisions?
Yes, thank you very much for that important question. Well, I think first, as I said, it's important, leadership is important. As you know, there in the case of Ethiopia, leadership is important in trying to bring parties together because there's always what is required, a willingness of parties to find a solution, and leaders make a huge difference. Sometimes they need mediators, impartial mediators to help them to reach a peace agreement. It's also important to look at the underlying sources of conflict, because to make sure that peace does not recur, you have to look at the underlying sources of conflict, political, economic, and social, and find a way of dealing with those structural issues and addressing those structural issues. And when there has been war, it's also important to find a way to bring those who have committed atrocities to account, because victims want to feel that crimes which have been committed, that justice is being done. But in addition to making sure that there isn't impunity for crimes, there also has to be reconciliation. To reconciliation between those groups which have been fighting. And then one always has to be on guard to develop a robust civil society, which is critical. And then, of course, to make sure that the foundations of democracy are strengthened. Because democracy, with all its flaws and all its imperfections, is critical in trying to prevent war. It is also critical in helping to promote and protect human rights. So democracy has an intrinsic importance and intrinsic worth, but it also has instrumental value.
Thank you very much. And not seeing any hands, so I think someone's got one. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. One question is more related about the current, I would say, ethos of polarization in the world, that people now are trying to just defend their own views instead of trying to find a common ground. And what are your thoughts about how to redress that? Or if that is something that we would expect to be taking place in the long term? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, you've given a very difficult question at the end. Yeah, because you're absolutely right. What we have, for example, on social media, and your generation, you are digital natives. My generation, we are digital migrants. You have people who go to sites and to areas to reinforce their own preconceived notions and a segmentation of views. I think one way, of course, that you start is in the classroom. You begin in the classroom, and that's where conflict prevention begins. And then you also make a determined effort to reach out to those who are different from you. And to, in addition, I think societies have to address the reasons which bring about polarization and difference in society. For example, globalization, I think, is one of the huge causes for this polarization, because globalization has brought about benefits to many, many people, millions of people, but there are also millions of people within society who have not benefited from globalization. And there are also huge differences and disparities because of globalization between countries. So that also needs to be addressed. And the recognition, I think, that global values, cosmopolitanism are not threats to national identities and particular interests, and that those can coexist, where you can have commitment to global values, where you can also at the same be proud of your particular interests. And we all have overlapping identities. And it is always dangerous when somebody asserts that there is only one aspect of their identity which matters, whatever that is, or other people only see one aspect of your identity. That always sets up the road to conflict. We have overlapping identities, and we should be proud and we should cherish those overlapping identities.
Thank you so much. All right, it looks like we have, okay, one more question from the audience, and then I think we'll have room for maybe one after that, and we will wrap up the session.
Hello, my name is Hamza. We know that a lot of protests around the world and movements that societies take to call for their rights in countries where there is lack of human rights and equity. These movements are usually faced by a huge violence by the governments, and that later usually leads to wars, and mostly civil wars, such as the situation in Syria and Libya. Why don't the United Nations take a significant position in these periods of time to prevent these peaceful movements from moving towards a huge armed conflict, costing the world so much loss of lives?
Yes. Well, thank you for the question. It's a complex question. First, I think when the basic question that always arises when people talk about the United Nations, the question is, what exactly is the United Nations? From the outside, the perception is always that the United Nations is a unitary organization which is expected to fulfill its responsibilities in all quarters. First, the United Nations is, of course, an organization of sovereign and independent states, and an arena for decision-making. Second, it constitutes the heads and those who work in international secretariats, the Secretary General and the executive heads and those who work in international secretariats. And third, the third United Nations is the supportive ecology of civil society and NGOs and business and academics who support the United Nations. And those three United Nations, the relationships between those three are dynamic and interactive. And most people, when they think about the United Nations, they sometimes think, well, it is the Secretary General who should do certain things. But of course, the Secretary General is not a head of state and is the head of an intergovernmental organization. But at most times, it is the member states who have to take action to bring about, if you're thinking about conflict prevention. So the Secretary General can do certain things. The Secretary General can use his good offices. I say his because we've not had a woman, but maybe we would have a woman Secretary General soon, to use his good office to bring about negotiations to prevent conflict. But there are other things which the member states can also do, whether it's in the General Assembly, in the Security Council, or as I mentioned earlier on, in the Human Rights Council, and also the Human Rights Commissioner, who has the lead role to work on human rights under the direction of the Secretary General. But human rights, I must say, of course, are one of the most contentious issues in international diplomacy, and they're a bed of nails for Secretaries General. Kofi Annan, whom I worked for, was, unlike any of his predecessors, was committed to the promotion of human rights and made the promotion of human dignity and advocating for human rights a signature of his Secretary Generalship. It is very difficult. You have to work at different levels. You have to work locally. You have to work nationally. And it's not only a job for the United Nations, it is a job for civil society. It is a job for NGOs. And ultimately, it is national governments who are responsible to make sure that human rights are protected and observed within their countries. And which is why, as I said earlier, that democracy without its flaws is vital to the promotion and the protection of human rights.
Thank you. And so we have a few more questions in the audience. Apologies to those on Zoom who might not get their question answered today. I think our first question from the audience here is
Amar from Kenya, and my question was on, okay, the international law, for example, has had so many weaknesses in the case that of its inability to enforce like the law or the action that they are taking towards all the conflict over the world. And I was wondering like, what is being done about it? Like there have been wars all over and it's been repeating itself over many decades. And this inability to enforce such laws or the sanctions or actions, what is being done about it?
Well, thank you very much for that question. But you see, there are many international law on its own cannot prevent war. It is critical in terms of a rules-based international order. International criminal law, for example, is critical, and we've had a lot of discussion in the recent weeks by the role of the international, the ICC, and the potential and the role of the prosecutor, and the possibility of future war crimes being carried out in Ukraine. But international law is just one instrument in terms of preventing conflict and in waging peace. You need international law for a rules-based international order. You also have a political dimension, you have a diplomatic dimension, and you also have an economic dimension. So all of those tools are critical. international law is one tool that you have at your disposal.
All right, wonderful. Samuel, I'm just checking in for time. Do we have? Okay. So it looks like we have maybe time for one more quick question, and I see one over here.
Hello, my name is Arlia. I'm from Singapore. I wanted to ask about, in your opinion, do you think the universal periodic reviews are an effective way of keeping countries accountable for human rights? Because I know, like, for Singapore, they have like consistently ignored the universal periodic review on like the safety of LGBTQ plus people in Singapore. And I'm just wondering, like, are there consequences for countries not listening to the advice from the UPR?
Well, thank you very much for that question. Of course, I should say that I mentioned Kofi Annan earlier on. One of Kofi's great contributions, his main institutional contribution to human rights was the establishment of the Human Rights Council after the discredited Human Rights Commission. And the Human Rights Council was adopted as part of his last wave of reforms in 2005 at the World Summit. And then the resolution bringing the Human Rights Council into being was adopted in 2006. It was an advance, of course, over the Human Rights Commission. It wasn't perfect by any means. So, for example, Kofi's initial recommendation was that you should have a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly for membership. That was watered down during the negotiations to a simple majority, underlining the fact that a Secretary General can propose, but it is the member states who dispose. But the Universal Periodic Review, I think, was one of the positive elements in the new Human Rights Council, that making sure that every nation is subject to this review. It was a huge advantage over the Human Rights Commission. Of course, it is left to the member states to follow through at the national level. The ultimate, of course, sanction is what we've just seen today, which this afternoon the General Assembly voted to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council. That is the ultimate sanction which can be done. So it exists, but there, of course, would have to be a sufficient enough number of countries to bring that about.
All right. Well, I think we have reached our time where we need to wrap up, but thank you so much, Professor Abby Williams. And if we could just give the professor a round of applause for answering our questions. Thank you.